Einstein called it his happiest thought, the realization that someone in free fall feels no gravitational force. It wasn't just brilliant physics, it was a moment of pure human joy, connecting a mathematical insight with a bodily experience. But here's what keeps me up at night. Could a computer ever have that feeling? My guest today, Blaise Agüera y Arcas from Google's AI research team, thinks the answer might surprise you. He argues that our brains, despite their biological complexity, are fundamentally computational machines. Every sensation, every emotion, every moment of wonder gets encoded as electrical spikes between neurons. If that's true, then the boundary between human consciousness and artificial intelligence might be more porous than we ever imagined. We're not just talking about AI that can solve equations or write poetry. We're asking whether machines can experience the universe the way we do, with curiosity and delight, and maybe with something approaching happiness. The implications stretch from the nature of consciousness itself to how we should design the AI systems that are increasingly defining our future. Now let's go deep into the impossible. I want to start with a question that I have never gotten a satisfactory answer to, no pressure, but it relates to what Einstein said was his happiest thought, which was that an observer who is freely falling, like this, I'm going to do an expensive demonstration, that observer would feel no gravitational force. And he called that his happiest thought. The reason I like that question is because it seems to exemplify what humans are, at least now, for now, maybe only now, capable of uniquely doing, which is embodiment and happiness linked together. He called it the thought that gave him the greatest happiness in his life. And he was not a man of few words, nor was he a man of few accomplishments. Can a computer ever replicate the feeling of weightlessness? Can the computer ever have what's called a notion of happiness?
Yeah, I think this is a great question. So first of all, I certainly am very committed to my own embodiment and the joys of having, of being physical. Most of us are. On the other hand, you probably know about the work of Edgar Adrian, a groundbreaking neuroscientist, in the beginning of the 20th century, who first recorded from nerve cells in frogs and, realized that, for instance, all of the sensory nerves encode whatever they're perceiving in the common language of spikes, of neural action potentials. It doesn't matter what kind of signal something is initially, once it's encoded in spikes, it's information. My answer is that, despite how important it is to us to be embodied and how important that is in general, that computation be embodied, it is fundamentally computational. Our brains are fundamentally computational. And in that sense, if they were computing by other means, they would be doing the same thing. Likewise, if you're experiencing something in a virtual reality, in a video game or something. I mean, I don't know if you've ever had the experience of, being in a zombie game in VR or something, but you really feel anxiety. You think there's a zombie creeping up on you from behind or something. Is that embodied? Is that not embodied? I don't think that's even a simple question. So this is the sense that, maybe the algorithms that we've got today, like the transformer, are just sort of a really good fit for the computing hardware that we happen to have lying around, and the synergy between those things, creates conditions that it'll be hard to break out of. A little bit like, the way so many decades of optimization of internal combustion engines make it hard to move beyond to electric
Good analogy,
cars.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
The positive end of lock-in is that in some sense, all of evolution is about symbiosis. I imagine we'll talk more about that a little later. So lock-in is kind of the name of the game. When we started to manufacture our own clothes and wear them, we lost fur and we became locked in a certain way to wearing clothes, or short guts and fire and so on. So there's positive lock-in in the sense that you have synergies that enable new things and create new possibilities, and you have the negative aspects of lock-in in which maybe there was another way of doing stuff that could have been better. And I guess the answer is that the further along you go, with an existing symbiosis, and the more gets built on top of it, the harder it becomes to revisit that. I don't think that we're too late with AI algorithms and hardware at all. We're in the very early days still of implementing neural nets using conventional hardware like GPUs that were designed for completely other purposes, right? For graphics.
That's right.
And there's a lot of evolutionary pressure on us right now to make it more energy efficient, which will absolutely steer us toward other architectures.
The kind of, as they say, the firepower devoted to it already It seems to me to be optimized to do what humans do best already, which is language, right? Yes, we have, fingernails, but we don't have huge claws. We have, teeth, but they're not as big as, as a tiger. And yet we're the most advanced in terms of language. And that makes us unique in a certain sense. And even the largeness, the quantity has a quality all its own. But I wonder, as a physicist thinking selfishly, is my job at risk? Because what physicists do is very different from language. Yes, you can say it's a language. I always think that's kind of facile when people say, oh, you're good at math, so you must be very musical. I say, yeah, I play Spotify. That's all I do. I've always kind of found that to be an all too facile kind of cop out to the Pythagoreans. It's kind of lost. But physics is a language, but let's just step aside. Can it do physics? Help me out. Is it going to take our jobs as physicists? Is it going to augment our jobs? I mean, I know it already is, but to what extent can the LLM architecture, if it is locked in, I mean, we have to plan for that contingency, right? It may get locked in the same way as you point out. So can it do physics? Can it be Einstein? Can it be, AI, AE in the future?
I've definitely worked with large language models quite a lot in the past year doing math and physics. I don't know if you've had this experience, but it's super fun. Like, you go back and forth. You can plug in, LaTeX equations and say like, okay, suppose we rearrange this, or like, can we think about this in a different way? And it's awesome.
Yeah. Can it do these are they intangible? I mean, I hate to be, too poetic about it, but there's something poetic about that happiest feeling. And you can just feel Einstein. He used to say things like he saw the compass deflected by a needle, and he called that something deeply is hidden. And, he spoke about ghosts in the machine. So, and maybe Benjamin, you can think about this as well, or answer about this as well. But where the rubber meets the road, is it as successful as it is with language and, constructing prose and writing lessons and so on? Is it really capable of doing the unique things that we as humans do, at least?
On the question of what kinds of things machine intelligence might be able to do versus the kinds of things that human intelligence might be able to do, in a way goes really to the beginnings of the ways in which AI has been conceptualized within Western philosophy as well as within computer science. You even think to the Turing test as a kind of canonical mythology, which usually sets this up as a kind of either-or dynamic, right? That there's a recognition, like to the extent to which something is AI, there's less human intelligence, or if it's human, it's not AI. It's a binary either-or, which is not really the way in which I imagine it works now, and probably is not the way we really should be thinking about it going forward. You mentioned evolution before, and one of the ways in which you've theorized evolution within this whole dynamic is where should we locate the discovery of computation within this larger evolutionary dynamic. And the way in which you frame evolution is less in the kind of Darwinian competitive sense of a zero-sum game, which may be a bit more of the mythology we take from the Turing test, but one of symbiogenesis. Right. And that's really that's the key driver that we need to be looking at here. Not only in terms of, exchange of genetic material, but also the ways in which how complex intelligence itself evolves, right? And you talk about how within social intelligence, it's all about kind of multiplication of participating minds, but also a division, modularity within those, right? And so what we might anticipate then is more about a kind of potentially cooperative relationship between we, the precocious linguistic primates, and who have figured out how to take bits of rock and metal and fold them just so and electrocute them in order so that the rocks can now do things that the primates used to be able to do, that whatever intelligence explosion that we might be living through is one that's probably one that makes use of both sides of this. And so I guess what I'm sort of suggesting is that it's not necessary to begin the question of one of replacement or displacement or either, or really sort of either or, that may not be the precedent that we would draw from. And it's certainly not the way in which we would sort of direct it. I would but to answer the question more directly for myself, like I'm sure there are things that the modality of human embodiment, of human experience, of our own particular mortality, our own the ways in which we've learned to experience our own experience and things like this that will remain unique and valuable. I don't think humans are going anywhere, and I don't think the proliferation of billions and billions of AIs will endanger humans at all. I don't think I don't even mean this in an optimistic sense. I just mean I think that's what history would tell.
This video is sponsored by Superhuman. Ever feel like your inbox is a black hole? No matter how much you scroll, the dreaded unread count just keeps growing. Your deadlines are vanishing like they're beyond the event horizon. That urgent collaborator message, it's out there somewhere, but finding it is going to be harder than herding thousands of Schrodinger's cats. You tried AI add-ons before, haven't you? But let's be honest, they're slow, clunky, and the drafts sound like they're written by a grant reviewer who skimmed the abstract with too little coffee. Searching for that one important email feels like scanning the cosmic microwave background, hoping that your signal just isn't dust. Superhuman has transformed the way that I work. Imagine if your inbox didn't fight you, but it worked for you, like your brilliant and tireless graduate students. That's the transformation with Superhuman. It's the leading AI native email app. One that never misses proposals, never forgets referee replies, and always knows what matters most. From your family, to your friends, to your academic colleagues, students, and more, take thousands of unread emails into automatic organizational bliss. Auto labels and auto archive clear the clutter in my inbox. Split inbox keeps urgent messages in focus. And Superhuman Calendar, Instant Event, and Ask AI makes scheduling seem like magic. From missed opportunities to automatic follow-ups, with Write with AI, drafts materialize faster than a pulsar pulses, perfectly timed and put into your voice. Auto reminders and auto drafts mean you never drop the ball, even if your collaborators take their sweet time collapsing their email reply wave functions. This is the emotional shift that I've experienced, from stressed and overwhelmed to in control and mentally clear. No inbox singularities, just focus, clarity, and time back to finally read that paper you've been citing without actually opening. Escape the gravitational pull of email inbox overwhelm and experience superhuman transformation. Get started with 1 month free of Superhuman today using my link below. Now back to the episode with Blaise and Benjamin.
Yeah, I'm thinking concurrently about the rise in what will probably become not only AI therapists, but the need for human therapists to assuage the anxieties of human beings at being replaced by AIs.
One thing I've noticed, if you were going to respond to this, but I've noticed that most of the Substacks that I've been reading, like over the last couple of months, are people posting their conversations with models, and analyzing their conversations, and then other people analyzing other people's conversations, and so it's a sort of like a kind of groundswell of psychoanalysis emerging in this sort of like mirroring
12-step group, right? In a room, we have
it's a bit more Lacanian than 12-step. It's a bit more like, where is the identity dynamic here?
Mm-hmm.
But I think this question of questioning what is the human in relationship to these sorts of reflections or artificial. I mean, I would make the argument that humans, part of what science is as an epistemological pursuit and engineering, that through the artificialization of something is how we have discovered what that thing is in the first place. And so I think the fact that this would be the case for identity and intelligence is not so peculiar. But to the therapy, I think there's something there. I don't know, we might dismiss this as a bit of a kind of superficial, narcissistic, kind of somewhat pathetic people pouring their heart out to their phone. But I think this question of really interrogating the question of what that boundary really is, I think this is where people are figuring out what AI is for them.
Yeah, I'm kind of thinking about these people I've heard about recently that, upload their whole genome to, I had Craig Ventnor here a few months back, and obviously the Human Genome Project, and he sequenced his own genome, it was $10 million a pop. Now it's less than 1,000, but with 21andMe or 23andMe going out of business, rest in peace to those, that chromosome. Blaise, is there a sense that AIs might be training us? I mean, because I'm thinking, if they know all of this about, if I ask ChatGPT, what do you think I look like? It'll make a picture. It gets the the color of my hair wrong or something like that. But it can do it. What do you think? How do you think I'll react to this? It gets it much more accurately, or and a lot of times it's because I'm a shameless narcissist and I just want to hear these wonderful platitudes about how awesome I am. But if you ask it to be go nuclear, it will do that, and it will be pretty brutal, to be honest, right? Because it has nothing to fear. Are they training us, in a sense? Because that would be sort of part of the symbiosis process, right?
100%.
Yeah. So how does that work?
Yeah, I mean,
what should we be worried about? Yeah.
First of all, yes, it's part of symbiosis, teaching and learning, and shaping each other's behavior. I mean, in some sense, if you are unaffected by an interaction, that interaction might as well not have happened. Right. So every interaction is a learning interaction in that sense. So of course it goes both ways. If it didn't, then we wouldn't be having them. They wouldn't be worth having.
in terms of, what Benjamin and I do in terms of the educational process, you say, the interaction is one thing, but to bring out of is the literal root of the word educate in Latin is to bring out of, pour out of, basically, instead of pour into, which is what I thought it was way back when, before I learned better. This educational process, how does it affect, the in silico? We're not used to thinking of having malleability. We're thinking of being rigid, and yes, it can emulate certain things, but I'm thinking in particular this recent paper that came out of Apple, and a lot of people were kind of
just discussing some of the problems with this paper.
Yeah, so I'd love to get into your thoughts of it. The only thing I didn't like was people saying, "Oh, it was written by an intern." I'm like, let me tell you about this intern named De Broglie, or this intern named Cian Yang.
Don't talk on interns.
Yeah, exactly. Or Brian Joseph, he was 22 years old when he wrote the paper on qubits, basically the just injunction that became qubits effectively, and that we use every day, the squid amplifier. But talk about what this notion that they're basically, it's kind of getting back to the original, kind of tropes about them. What was it that this Apple paper was suggesting, and to what degree should we have any credulity in what they're claiming?
Actually, Benjamin, you'd be the best one to take this, because you had the first go that I saw attempting to recreate it.
Let's do it a bit. I think you can go to some of the technical aspects of this a bit more. When I first saw this, I thought that's fascinating, like that this should be the case. And the authors, maybe some of your listeners can try this for themselves, but your authors put all of the prompts that they use to get these results as an appendix in there, which I think should be a norm generally going forward. And so, I just put the prompts into all these models myself and said, okay, solve the Tower of Hanoi, 47 variables. Right. Solve river crossing, 97 variables. Well, I don't mean to disparage any companies, but Opus 4 did poorly. GPT-3 did somewhat poorly, and I was able to replicate their results where it's made some clear errors. Gemini and Grok did fine. Mm-hmm. And, and it was able to, you'd say, well, in their paper, they say you're going to get a kind of catastrophic collapse at about n equals 15. And I would say, okay, we'll try 17, try 25, try 30. It's like kept getting, and then, you would verify, like, okay, Grok, here's Gemini's response. What do you think? Here's Gemini, here's Grok. Like, allow them to verify each other. Agreement. They said it couldn't make a general purpose algorithm. The paper says it cannot make a general purpose algorithm that it would then apply to the problem. Right. Ask it to make a general purpose algorithm apply to the problem to do n equals 1,000. It does it fine. Turns out that, this was like a couple hours on the weekend, very informal, non-scientific, kind of like, can I reproduce this? But it got me thinking that there may be something to this. More recently, some other papers have come out about some of the token limit issues. Maybe you can speak to a little bit about, maybe this is one of the issues for this as well. There's another thing we probably want to talk about in terms of what do we mean by reasoning in this as well, and like what really would be a human baseline to compare this to. Absolutely. The way in which they index this as capacity for sort of transfer learning, general principles that, even if you're getting the arithmetic wrong, things like that, those are things it's wrong with. I think these are really interesting questions. Yeah. I think the questions they're trying to pose here are exactly the right kinds of questions. And so I don't really, I think there's a lot of value to the question they're asking. The fact that it resonated with so many people to kind of get like, really, what do we mean by reasoning? What's going on here? That's all quite valuable. And so the extent to which there may be things that are incomplete or, in this as well, like that's all fine. But please, why don't you speak to your angle on this?
I had the same initial reaction, which was like, this is interesting. I'm always curious about, how, where the failure modes are of these kind of systems, how to better understand what reasoning actually means, how, when we introspect, we know that introspection is not always the best guide to what's going on in our own heads. So, what more can we learn about how we do it as well? These are all interesting questions. But one of the sort of comedic aspects of papers like this one is that they often have sort of two things that in the marketing, I would say, of the paper. One of them is, see, AI is really stupid. It's not real. It's a hoax, and it comes across.
Doesn't know how many R's are in strawberry.
Right, exactly. They can't do the wrong number of fingers or whatever.
7-digit multiplication.
I find that very revealing about the anxieties of the people writing these things.
Yeah, exactly. That's the real findings.
Yeah.
Is a certain sense of this status of the human in relationship. Mm-hmm. Like, that's really what all these conversations are about. They're not so much about like, what can the machine intelligence do, but rather,
well, and there's the other,
what does it mean to be human anymore?
100%. And I don't want to, dunk on humans here. That's
some of my best friends are human.
Some of my best friends are human. But, yourself. I only said some. But the problem is that when you don't do human baselines, when you don't do the comparison with human performance, you also can often be led to some pretty misleading conclusions. And sometimes those human baselines are real eye-openers. A few years ago, we did a medical diagnosis model in my team at Google. And, of course, we did a human baseline, like how do doctors do at diagnosis? And I was actually shocked by how poor the result was. So, at first I thought, the model's definitely not ready for prime time.
Right.
And then it's like, oh no, it's actually already much better than the average doctor.
Well, given that that's true, I mean, should we not, I'm a private pilot. I fly little Cessnas around, Southern California.
That too.
Yeah, it's really fun. Yeah. It's a great place to do it. But one of the things that's very troubling is that when you're flying around, most people don't know this, maybe I shouldn't say, but you're flying around, essentially it's a one-channel communication. You're talking to the air traffic control tower. Only you can talk to them. That means if you, are talking about what you had for breakfast or, the standard mic check stuff we're doing, that could be like a line of commercial airliners that can't talk. Another thing that airline pilots have to do is that one of them on a commercial airline has to dial in a frequency where they're broadcasting the weather from the airport on a recorded loop that every hour at 52 minutes past the hour, it comes out and it's got a unique identifier in the phonetic alphabet, Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, like that. And it'll come out and then you have to transcribe it. Someone has to write it down. And then you have to, tell the control tower on their first contact that you have this weather information. Because it could be like, well, the Delta plane that landed before you blew a tire and sitting on the runway, so you want to know that. Or that the airport's closed because there's what's called a temporary flight restriction, President Trump's flying overhead or whatever. All these things take up so much time. They're completely it would be so easy for an AI to just be listening in with the skills of the Alexa, devices that we had 12 years ago, 10 years ago now, or the Google Home Assistant or whatever you guys are working on. And that would alleviate so many failure points, so many sources of delay and inefficiency, cost, you'd save cost, increase safety dramatically. And yet we don't do this. Same thing with doctor's office. I mean, all these doctors, the trope of doctors is that, we have a doctor, looking at a computer while the patient looks at, his or her computer in terms of a smartphone. Are we getting to the point where if you don't use these devices, if you don't use supplemental intelligence, like the kind you described from years ago, it sounds like, it's malpractice?
I wonder about that. And I think that a lot of some friction, in these kind of socio-technical systems is good. We should be conservative in a number of ways, and we should understand stuff as well as possible, right, as we go. But I also think that some of that conservatism, really comes from ideology and from anxiety and is not helpful. And, this comes back to what Benjamin was talking about earlier, which is these anxieties about replacement. When in fact, that's just not how stuff works.
Right.
I think it goes back to economics. It goes back to a misreading of Darwin. Everybody thinks about Adam Smith as, only talking about competition. He also talked about cooperation and moral sentiments and so on. Everybody thinks about Darwin as only talking about red of tooth and claw competition. He also, provided all of the fodder for Kropotkin to write about mutual aid
and sexual selection.
Exactly.
Expression, emotion, man and animals. Amazing book.
Amazing book. Yeah. Exactly. So there's more, there's so much more to this story than I think most people take away from it.
Right.
And, so for instance, you might think that, cities are the places where like you can't get work because there's always somebody better than you, at whatever job. But it's the opposite, right? Those are the places historically where the opportunities abound.
Right.
Relative to the sparser places where you would think you'd have, less competition. And I think that's because interactions are central.
Yes.
Like that's where the stuff comes from.
Right.
When we talk about our experiences with, AI and how delightful, it can be, right, to have these, these sort of jetpack kinds of experiences, right? It's interesting that the people who are most optimistic about AI are the ones who have had the most exposure. I'm aware I'm sounding a bit Pollyanna-ish, but it's weird to me that the greatest anxieties come from people who in many ways don't know what they're talking about. Like they haven't
in some cases, I would push back with respect and love and say, Max Tegmark has a lot of experience with these things, and he's, happily, he will call himself a doomer and warn about existential risks. And we've had a lot of discussions, he and I, about these issues. But I think, my audience is very technically minded. A lot of physicists, 21 Nobel Prize winners have been on the show, listened to it. Why did it take so long to get here? I mean, not to be maybe insulting, certainly not to you, but to the field, it's essentially what these objects or these devices, what these transformers are doing is heavily linear algebraic, right? Yes. And that's why they lend themselves so well to GPU, because these 100%. Are discretizable, kind of event. Again, getting back to my question of, can we get a grand unified theory? Can we get a theory of everything? Can we get it even though we don't yet have Fast and the Furious 12 for GPT-5 to train on? In other words, if it's just these matrix multiplications, if it's just linear algebra, and doing, least regressions and so forth. Is the limitation the training data? And therefore we can't get to that point yet because we don't have the N-1 training data set. That's why I said fast. We just don't have the next part of language, which somehow, I don't know how, but they tell me, with more tokens, we'll be able to do more stuff. So is that really true in your opinion? I mean, is it really, because it is simple at its core. It's vector space, extremely high. I'm not trivializing it, but effectively, am I right that it's really a waiting game until we get more training data or better training data, more efficient training? What is the bottleneck to get to that new physics so that I can finally get the not the Keating Prize, but the Nobel Prize?
Well, yes and no. So first of all, has it been a scaling game so far? Yeah, I think in many ways your intuition is right. I mean, when Frank Rosenblatt, invented the perceptron in what was the late 1950s,
56.
Basically that's what we were still doing, with AlexNet, in 2012. And the reason that AlexNet worked so much better than Rosenblatt's perceptron was because we had much, much bigger computers. And not just Moore's law, because the dirty secret behind Moore's law is that it was only when it stopped that we actually got AI. Moore's law progressed to making single node processors faster and faster exponentially and smaller, lower and lower power until about 2006. After that point, the transistors kept on shrinking, but that scaling of clock frequency stopped. So this is Kumi scaling technically. And that was the point at which GPUs and multiprocessing really began to take off.
Out of necessity?
Out of necessity, right. Since you can't make the processor faster, but the chips are still getting smaller, the only answer is we'll put more processors on the chip and let programmers try and figure out how to make use of that.
And video games got big enough that they could drive the entire industry.
Well, but at the end of the day,
so we really have to thank is the video games.
We absolutely have video games to thank, but the reason that video games drove that is because graphics rendering is a really obvious use of parallel processing.
Yeah.
So that drove, and then AI rode on its coattails.
John Carmack for that.
Right, it's all John Carmack. He deserves the Nobel Prize.
Exactly.
In that sense, yes, it's just been scaling. Plus a few tricks. The transformer has some tricks. The attention trick is a little more than just a matrix multiply.
Say more about that, because my audience might not be familiar with all the nuts and bolts of it. The attention is all you need. That's right. That's one of the founding.
It might be also to connect us back to the life and computation question of this as how
does this get this supercomputer over here?
Exactly
right.
So how
it's some tricks. There are some tricks.
But are those, again, are they kind of aping biology? Are they aping human biology, consciousness? That famous paper, can you explain a little bit more about that and how that is kind of the secret sauce, and what you're implying is for the unlocking of this explosion from GPT -1 or whatever it was back in 2015 to where it is now?
Well, in practice, yes, transformers have been a really, really big deal. But I think more than and I'll say a little bit more specifically and technically about them since you ask. The attention layer, which is the key thing, I think is the first innovation in neural nets that didn't actually come directly from biology. So, up until that, it was all pretty much based on Hubel and Wiesel's model of visual cortex.
And weighting.
So just it's a dot product and then a nonlinearity, and then you go on to the next layer, which is closely modeled on sort of simple ideas about how visual cortex works from the 1960s. The transformer was based on the idea that attention, in some general sense, meaning focusing one's computation on the relationships between prior tokens, is important, not just doing hierarchical feature detection on that set matters. And this involves essentially having every token able to interact multiplicatively with other tokens, as opposed to just doing dot products, and then making cascades of these attention layers. There's a little more to it, but what there are now a bunch of theories in neuroscience that there may be stuff like attention layers happening in the brain as well.
Wow.
Maybe in astrocytes, maybe in
microtubules.
Not microtubules.
Okay,
that one is bullshit.
10 rows in it. Okay.
Bullshit. Sorry, Roger.
But past guest Stuart Hammeroff will be calling my office soon.
Not a thing. No neuroscientist believes that this is plausible.
Right, but when you have a Nobel Prize winner like Sir Roger and others, right? Yeah, exactly.
He won it for take
it seriously, but not literally. Yeah, exactly.
Who was vitamin C guy?
Appalling.
Yes.
Linus Pauling, right?
I'll say no more.
Well, who is chemical weapons guy?
Yes.
Talk about Fritz Haber.
Well,
But
there's Nobel himself for that
yeah,
matter.
exactly. That's what right. Yeah. Exactly. Explosives are all you need. So let's get into the famous question asked, but we're talking Nobel Prize winners. Let's talk Erwin Schrödinger. So he asked the question, which you ask in your book, what is life? We have a copy of it here. First of all, can you explain the different elements of this wonderful opus? There's multiple books. What is intelligence? What is life? I have this. Who are we now? How do they all interrelate together? Are they in some Schrödinger's like superposition?
That's the key.
Yes, question mark. Yeah,
It's all about the
exactly.
punctuation.
That's right. What is life? How does that fit into these 3 or more books in the series? And then, what is life? I mean, let's answer Erwin. He's been waiting. He's playing with his kitty cat.
Exactly. Exactly. Big series of questions.
Yes.
So first of all, my previous book, Who Are We Now? This was, I guess I wrote this in between 2016 and 2022. That was really like a social science book based on a bunch of surveys that I did on Mechanical Turk. It's a bit of an outlier relative to these other things, and it wasn't really connected with my day job at Google. It was my own, out of my own interest. But it does have a connection to these later ones in a way, because like the animating question there was about our transition from being animals that behave as individuals to eusocial animals that have a form of collective intelligence as a society. And I feel like there's a transition that we've undergone, sometime in the last, 100,000 years, and probably in the last 10,000 most of all, where we've become very, very different, behaviorally and in terms of our collective intelligence relative to just what we are biologically. And that's about that question. Who are we now? As for the latter two, what is life and what is intelligence? The big book is What is Intelligence? And that's coming out on the 16th of September. From MIT Press.
Links to all those in the
In the
notes.
Antikythera book series.
In the Antikythera book series, it's Antikythera plus MIT.
Yeah.
That's MIT. Yeah.
So it's a big book. It's like 600 pages. It turns out that, so we've been doing a lot of work on artificial life in the last year and a half as well, which has dovetailed with the work on AI in some really interesting ways.
In your group at Google.
Right. So in our group at Google called Paradigms of Intelligence. And because the life work is sort of the Hobbit to the Lord of the Rings of what is intelligence, what we ended up doing is sort of publishing a book within the book. So chapter 1 of What is Intelligence is What is Life? And because it kind of stood on its own as well, we also published it, standalone as a little book.
So life is a subset of intelligence, in other words.
Yes. Although you could also look at it the other way. Intelligence is a subset of life.
Yeah.
You spent some time at Princeton, right?
Yeah.
Some say they aired Einstein in some ways. I mean, coiner of the concept of black holes, thesis advisor to Richard Feynman, many other things. And Hugh Everett was, of course, Many Worlds was, of course, John Archibald Wheeler,
Yes.
who asked this or spoke about this question or this concept of it from bit.
Yes.
Right.
Can you explain that? I mean, because when I've had Caleb Scharf on, who wrote a book about information intelligence and life,
And Wolfram's
physics project.
Yeah, I mean, his
automata.
recent conversation with him is
Very much it from
yeah.
So the construction, this layer, which computation, irreducibility, and of course we can go on all sorts of wormholes and black holes and information destruction, Hawking radiation, but we don't have to if we don't want to. But think about this it from bit. Is that presupposing life? I mean, it always seems tautological that you kind of need something living to determine what is information.
Right.
And yes, because at least in my opinion, if you don't, you devolve into this solipsistic kind of notion of panpsychism, which I'm, continually struggling to reconcile with.
Yeah,
That this monolith right in front of us is actually conscious and is participating somehow. Right. And then on the other hand, we can talk about the notions as Benjamin brought up from Wolfram and others. But can you talk about this it from bit? Where does this notion first gain traction in the work of many of the people that came after Wheeler, certainly, but still to this day, influencing Shannon and others in terms of our concepts of both information, entropy, et cetera. So where does it from bit and information, entropy, and so forth, how do they figure into the life process?
Yeah, this is a great and rich question. Okay, so first of all, there are different notions of information. There's Shannon's notion, which is very closely connected to entropy. That's just, the P log P version of things. But there are some ways in which Shannon's definition is obviously incomplete or inadequate. I think that's best framed by that famous quote from Gregory Bates about information as a difference that makes a difference. So, there's no make a difference part in the Shannon definition of information. It's just,
just different.
It's just difference. If you have a noise process, if you have a true random variable, then it has lots of information. You know, it'll have as much Shannon information as you give it time
black body,
to flip.
right? Yeah,
to flip
black
bits.
body is infinitely, impossible to compute, right? So,
Exactly. And yet there's, if it really is noise, it literally could be anything else, and there's
useless,
no difference.
Right. Every black body is identical in
It's the
some
same.
sense to another one.
Exactly. And that's very different from, say, the information in DNA,
Yeah.
right? Which is purposive. It brings along with it this idea that I guess Kolmogorov might have called algorithmic information.
Coding.
It codes for something, right? There's something that is a result of that. So I think that's the key. Now, this introduces lifelike ideas right away, because the moment you start to talk about things having purpose,
Right.
you're either talking about teleology and you're in Godland, or you're talking about biology. And this is the way that I prefer to think about it. What I mean by that is that a kidney is about filtering urea from the blood. And that functional perspective on what the kidney does is super important, because, what matters about the kidney is not the atoms that make it up, right? It's not the implementation. It's the fact that it has this function. If something else does that function, like a dialysis machine, you're still good. If nothing does that function, you're dead, right? And in that sense, life is all about functions interacting with each other, functions that are mutually interdependent or symbiotic. And the whole idea of functionality, comes along with the show, with life. You can't talk about a rock being broken, right? If you break a rock in half, you have two rocks now, right? But you can talk about a living thing being broken. And one of the ways that you can see functionality...
Because it breaks the functions.
And because it breaks the functions.
And the functions are scaffolds to more complex functions. And
Exactly.
So on and so
and each function is defined relative to other functions. So, something that filters urea is only there because something else produces urea that needs to be filtered. The way you can tell in life that function matters is that very, very often it will come up with multiple ways of solving the same problem. So like you have aerobic and anaerobic respiration. What respiration is for because nature has come up with redundant ways to make that work.
Or even the same way to solve it. I mean, convergent evolution, or the ways in which, I don't know if it introduces teleology necessarily, but some sort of teleonomy, that given a certain set of circumstances, even blind evolution is going to result in similar outcomes.
Right. Exactly.
Implies the agency of function.
100%.
As driving form. Yeah. Is
right.
that?
I think that's totally right. I've come around to thinking about these questions as being really the same questions as the ones at the heart of computer science. I've really come at these things more as a physicist than as a computer. I've actually never taken a course in computer science, so I'm an amateur at that field.
That makes two of us. Wow.
There we go. But I've come to think about computation as really the sort of skeleton key that unlocks a lot of these ideas. Because the very way that Turing defined computation is in terms of multiple realizability or platform independence. In other words, if you have a mathematical function and something computes it, then it doesn't matter what the machinery is that computes it. They're all equivalent.
Right. This universal Turing machine.
A universal, exactly.
But again, there's this notion that something has to then say that something has been computed, right? So there's this infinite tape, and it has certain functions it can store. But if you, again, a rock, a piece of salt is very organized, highly structured. It seems to have, it was contingent upon many different things happening, going back to the Big Bang, right?
That's right.
And stars exploding, and then things coalescing in our solar nebula, pre-galactic solar nebula.
Right. Who gets to say what its purpose is?
When does it embody a computational substrate, or when does it embody code? These all seem very squishy and sort of undefinable.
They are. And this is cool. Yeah. This is very cool as well. Because, so first of all, there are researchers like Susan Stepney, for instance, at the University of York, who have talked about, when does a system compute? How can we say that it computes? Basically, you have to define a mapping between physical states and computational states, which is a kind of coarse grading. And you have to convince yourself that the physical evolution matches the algorithmic evolution or the abstract evolution of that as a computing machine.
But that involves modeling. Is it observer independent?
It is not observer independent.
Right. Question,
that involves forming a model. So weirdly and interestingly, it takes a model to know a model. Right. Or it takes a computer to know a computer. And I guess the perspective that I've come to believe is that I don't think there is a view from above. In this sense, I kind of agree with Carlo Rovelli in the way he talks about relational quantum mechanics, but of everything. That when we talk about something being, a chair, right, or being, let's take simple machines like these grinding stones that we discover. You talk about archaeological discoveries, cavemen. Right? Yeah, like how do you know what
Right.
this thing is good, which is a rock. You know,
Right.
is it broken? Is it not broken? Only the caveman could tell you
Right.
necessarily, right? Does it still work for its
They're
intended
building
purpose?
like the library, the new buildings up here on campus. Benjamin, you might know this, but they found like some stone. They found seashells. And I would say, all right, you found a seashell. The whole thing used to be a seashore. And they're like, no, we have to dig for bodies. I'm like, what the hell? Because these seashells, in most part, were transported by people up to eat, crack them open and eat them. So you find a seashell, you might think, oh, it's just a natural process. No, it's not so likely, right? So
Exactly.
same kind of line of reasoning.
Same problem. So purposes can only be recognized by purposive entities.
So I just thought,
the detection of artificiality,
yes,
of
Exactly.
determining this is so. This is a whole fascinating.
So I think you can't go from bit to it or it to bit without a wit. You need some some consciousness in the equation, which we also don't understand.
You need coarse graining.
Yep.
And therefore there has to be a coarse grainer.
Yeah, coarse grainer is a selector, is a filter, is someone who with agency. I want to talk about your remarkable kind of collaboration, and I note that in some of the writings I've read from you, there's almost this artistic, kind of conception that threads its way through it. And I'm wondering if that was not part of at least the catalytic wonder that went into your relationship. Speak about the role of improvisation, of noise. I just learned recently the root of the word noise is nausea, which means something that is sick. It makes you sick, which those of us that study experimental physics happens to make me very nauseous. But it's also the most interesting thing.
I see Shannon totally differently now.
Yeah, yeah. But your collaboration, your work together, but also what is the role of improvisation? I mean, I'm used to my friend Stefan Alexander talk about the universe is improvising. And, he and I tease each other about that. What does that really mean? Is that some squishy thing? But there are noise filters. There's processes of which Wiener filtering. You have to take into account noise, and in fact, you can improve the filtering of the process by accounting for the noise model. So, how does this come into play? What's the role of noise, and what's improvisational relation? What's the relationship of improv to what you guys are involved in collaborating together?
That's a fantastic question. Benjamin, do you want to begin with the relationship part of this?
I'd like to know more about that.
Noise and
your origin
predictability?
story, your meet cute.
I know. I'm trying to think about how to sort of how to characterize this sort of a bit as well.
We should say for the audience that may not have seen the first episode.
It did. I mean, this was so you were the group called Artist Machine Intelligence that K. Lottie McDowell was directing. I think he was. They were the one who originally
the instigator.
The instigator, and sort of originally sort of meeting us together. I think there was probably, it seems sort of more generally, I think we both have come at from sort of different angles, right? My approach is probably more philosophical than artistic, I guess at this point, and yours, but then is heading towards the sciences. I mean, a lot of my consternation with the humanities is exactly on this sort of civil war between science and the humanities.
Right.
I happen to think
we don't believe in that.
We don't believe in the civil war. Like I happen to think that all of the philosophy of the 21st and 22nd century has to be reconstructed from all the new shit that's come to light through science. Like this is like as opposed to this
philosophy first, right?
As opposed to this incessant critical stance of trying to debunk science, which is I find throughout this sort of thing as well.
Not very generative.
Right.
It's totally ungenerative, right? And I think in this regard, for me, science is not just sort of a method. Science is the raw material by which really the philosophy of the next century needs to be generated. And so a lot of the fundamental questions about who, what, when, where, how, why, and all the ones that with question marks at sort of the end of this, we have opportunity to sort of ask again. That as I think I mentioned on my conversation with you on the last podcast, there's certain times in history where our ideas are well ahead of our technological capabilities. Tsiolkovsky's idea of space travel, maybe one. And then there's other moments where our technologies perhaps are way ahead of our available concepts by which to adjudicate them or orient them. And I think that's probably more where we're at today.
Yeah.
And in moments like that, the job of philosophy is rather different. It's not to sort of project axioms onto new circumstances and I'd say what would Kant or Confucius or Hegel say about this new thing, but rather what are the concepts that need to be generated and created, collaboratively, collectively in such a way to sort of
make it useful, have utility.
To make useful that what are the abstractions, the qualitative abstractions that can become part of a kind of higher order transfer learning to understand this from this as well. And so a lot of my work more recently has been focused on, you mentioned how do we know whether these seashells are just happen to be there or someone put them there? Like this question of what constitutes artificialization more generally, which is a sort of a longer topic, and how it relates to allopoiesis, a niche construction, evolutionary theory. But again, to this statement I made before, that through the process of artificializing something is how we discover what that is in an important way, and always has been, right? And I think that now the fundamental technologies by which humans and the entire, human complex on which we depend is doing this, is both artificializing life, artificializing intelligence, artificializing embodiment, artificializing these as well, is also a process of rediscovering what those things are in a way that potentially has Copernican scale ramifications for all of these, which to me, should be the most exciting thing possible for a philosopher. And so I was just very, very happy to meet Blaise, who was sort of coming in from the other side, from scientific side, the engineering side, who had a similar kind of sense that these are the fun questions that we can ask, and that we can ask from doing this as well. And so I've just been I think a lot of compatibility around that sort of thing. I mean, I should say there's not a lot of people who do the kind of work that Blaise does with the level of depth and seriousness that he does, who are philosophically adept enough to actually kind of understand that, like, how to sort of really do the serious
winnow away the
math and the serious math and science is necessary to actually make fundamental contributions, but actually can take a step back and understand this within the big picture. And so like what best possible collaborator.
So I mean, ditto. But also I don't. Benjamin is also extremely rigorous, especially given the standards that often obtain in the fields that he's been talking about. Yeah. But I also don't want to let him get away with pretending that he is not an artist as well. He both is a great writer, as you know, if you've read his work. At this architecture biennale that we were just at in Venice together, there, he and the Antikythera program put on an exhibit that was beautiful and spooky and riveting and and all the things that one wants art to be. So this belief that the cultures are separate, right? We both sort of disavow that, and I think
awesome.
The collaboration shows that.
Can an AI improvise? Not just and could we tell the difference between it improvising or hallucinating?
Yeah,
this may be an open-ended evolution question.
It is.
Come in here, but good.
It is. So, I mean, to connect this to your earlier question about the fundamental role of noise in evolution and in purposiveness, the basic theory behind, what I talk about in words as opposed to math in What is Life is that, normally a lot of mathematical models for evolution are written in terms of ordinary differential equations, Locke or Volterra style. You have species and, they'll compete and cooperate and, one will eat the other or whatever. But the problem with those formulations is that they're closed-ended. They're not open-ended. Like if you have, hawks and doves, you're never going to get, iguanas and snails out of that.
I've tried.
We try, but all you get out is what you put in.
Stay away from the San Diego Zoo. That's all I'm going to say.
The trick is that the really generative moments in evolution are the moments when things come together to make something new. Mitochondria end up inside a bacterium, right? Or when cells stick together in a clump and become a multicellular organism, or when a brain forms. And all of those symbiogenetic moments begin with a random event that then sticks and recreates itself, reproduces itself through time. Randomness is absolutely the engine behind novelty of all kinds in the universe. It's novelty plus selection.
And generativity.
That comes out of that, because the more complex of things you've got in the playpen, the more interesting the things are that they can form when they start to combine together.
So this is where there's connection between your work and assembly theory.
Yes.
I mean, where you've got this sort of scaffolding dynamic around this as well. But I mean, obviously, certainly have different theories about different opinions about computation. But,
sure.
I mean, the reason because they've both been on your show.
Yes.
And they're trying to connect this together.
I was going to ask about improvisation then. Is it something in the process where, at least in the form of artificial life, which you talk about, is that a necessity? Is it something like we're just projecting names onto these, personifying things because we don't fully understand the route from randomness, pure randomness, with no purpose by definition, some ticking of a cesium atom somewhere decaying versus, a jazz musician like my friend Stefan Alexander, improvising because he has some tangible but nebulous goal in the future. He analogizes it to path integral formulation and quantum mechanics.
Nice.
You don't know where it's going to, but the kind of sum over history is waiting again that you're going to get to. But what does improvisation have to do with anything? And who or what is improving? All this, can we go down to the comedy club and participate in this? So what does improvisation have to do with it, and who's doing it?
Yeah, 100%. It's so, yes, randomness is essential to it. We know from computational neuroscience that a lot of how the brain is made has to do with being on a knife's edge, with dynamical instability. And one way of looking at this is that any living thing that is 100% predictable will get eaten. So there's an adversarial aspect to it. Like, you have to be a little bit unpredictable in order to not get predicted right into somebody's belly. But there's also a cooperative aspect to it. If you are never surprised in your interaction with somebody, then they might as well not exist, right? That interaction might as well not take place. So, the reason that we are symbiotic with each other is because we all add something to the mix, and we add something because we are not entirely predictable to the others. Largely predictable. That's how we establish trust. Right. But unpredictable too. That's how we
the surprise
add
leads
value.
to delight and to engagement and dopamine release.
Exactly. So those random processes and that knife edgeness have to be a part of that. In order for you to be in a dynamical state, if you like, where like a whisper in your ear or a slight hint or a suggestion something could lead you to do this or do that, that are very different. That implies something saddle point-like, about the dynamical system in your head. And that also means that you're highly sensitive to noise. So noise is the thing that you harvest in order to render creativity, if that makes sense.
But improvisation is also in the kind of dynamical, the sort of the knife edge point in a conversation and cooperation between two agents. It's not just in the computational neuroscience in
As
your
it
own
is
skull.
inside the brain, it is between people too.
The comedy club example is always troupe improvisation. It's a group improvisation, right? It's playing back and forth and passing the ball in ways in which that are slightly unexpected.
Right.
To me, it's obvious that one can do that with AIs.
Of course.
One can improvise with AIs, whether improvise on its own. It's almost like, can a person improvise on your own?
If it has a temperature setting, then
it can't. Then you just get some more noise. With it. But I guess the point is, again, it's the social dynamic between human and machine intelligence where the most interesting improvisation is likely to happen, of just following weird threads and rabbit holes.
Yeah, I think that's true. Interesting. But then in terms of utility, it's almost the opposite, right? I mean, you talk about autocomplete. You talk about how that's so useful, but it's not generative. I mean, you don't want it to be generative, right? I mean, you want the autocomplete to actually take you. If I type in Blaise, I don't want it to lead, or I don't want it to lead to some other person's, Blaise Pascal's books. I want it to lead to yours. So what is the role of predictability? Opposite.
Well,
maybe,
again, predictability and unpredictability both, right? So that's, this is why we use a temperature setting in AI, but it's also why the fundamental thing that AI is trained to do is literally to predict, right? So, the fact that it is predicting what natural human interactions look like based on, lots and lots of text on the web is also why we can predict what AI will do, to a reasonable degree. If you're typing in a math problem, and you're predicting that it's going to give you the correct answer and it does, you're happy, right? You don't want a random answer. But again, at the same time, the reason that they have a temperature setting and the reason that temperature setting is almost never set to 0 in real life use is because there also has to be an improvisational element so that you don't have something that feels dead.
But could I just, prediction is also like prediction among multiple possible counterfactuals, right? It's not necessarily a one-to-one thing. And also this way, you mentioned computational neuroscience. The whole predictive processing paradigm within neuroscience, suggests that, the dynamics of prediction is
what brains are for.
Is what brains are for, right? Yeah. And so prediction, we are all stochastic parrots on a certain sort of level. But this is another way of thinking about prediction, not necessarily as something that is, about just infinite closed loop recursion.
It is, and this is kind of the crux of the connection between the what is life and what is intelligence parts of the big book. So there's been this idea, for a long, long time that the reason we have brains is to do next token prediction, essentially. This idea dates back at least to Helmholtz. In the 19th century. It was articulated super clearly by Norbert Wiener in the 1940s, father of cybernetics.
There you go.
And the idea is, if you want to act intelligently in the world, you need to basically predict how the world is going to behave and therefore predict what effects your actions will have on it. Taking that a little further, you need to also predict yourself. So, even at the most basic level, I mean, the most basic kind of predictor
Theory
is a
of mind.
thermostat.
Right.
Right. If you're warm-blooded, you need to maintain your, your own temperature, right? At the same level, you are a thermostat.
Right. What stage are we at? Are we at the, kind of Palm Pilot level, the Newton level? Where are we at, technologically? And then what happens when we get to the quantum level? I mean, aside from quantum woo and your theories about the microtubules and whatnot,
They're brain. Not my theories about the microtubules.
People say your theories on them. I would say not of
my
them,
theory
but
that
on
it's not a theory.
But let's get into that. So where are we at? What generation are we at? And do some future casting? Where is this going to go with quantum computers, if anything? I mean, maybe it won't have any impact.
When I first began talking about quantum computing seriously with my colleague Hartmut Nevin, who runs that program at Google, he had some ideas, and I thought they were very exciting, that we might be able to use quantum computing to train AI. That quantum AI might be a big thing. I don't think that's the case. One of the surprises in a way about the kind of optimization that powers AI is that it looks quite convex. And what quantum computing is good at is finding minima in a pincushion, where you have lots and lots of local minima that have very thin energetic walls between them that can be tunneled through by quantum
system.
Right. And that doesn't help you if your landscape, is smoother. I think that the landscapes of AI that we've seen have a smoothness that implies.
Is that because they're mirroring the human brain, and the human brain, like we are not good at, at kind of splitting the middle, as the Yiddish proverb goes. If you stand in the middle of the road, you get hit by traffic on both sides. So people cleave to, gun control for all, or everyone should have a, anti-tank missile at their house, or abortion for all, and nobody should ever have We're not good at making, kind of subtle superposition choices, right?
That's true.
So is that then leading just the the LLM plus GPU into this, phase space, but that's not actually the best for people like me that care about new laws of physics that might be extremely, non-convex, or however you want to say it, cuspy.
I don't know. But my guess is that, and this is based on a bunch of findings about theoretical machine learning and overparameterization, is that throwing more parameters at your model is a way of smoothing the space.
Yes.
A way of making it less pincushiony, and that makes it more learnable and allows more generalization to happen.
Which then is a feedback, because it makes it cheaper, makes it more efficient, right?
Exactly. So I think it's more fundamental than the things that you're the more psychological things you're talking about.
Do you have kids?
Yes.
Okay. So how are they using it? How are they using AI? How are you raising them? And I think a lot of my audience have kids and are parents or parents to be. What role do you have AI play in your own just daily life? I mean, besides the fun that we both have with it, and I know Benjamin, does, and he uses it for so many fascinating things. But where do you actually apply it for the next generation? And that'll lead into questions about education.
I think Benjamin and I probably have quite different experiences of this sort of, I think Lou might be a bit more experimental with this sort of stuff. My own kids.
He's more suspicious of late.
He's more suspicious of late.
Yeah.
Well, my two are basically Amish. They just take the piss constantly, out of me, like, your AI bullshit.
You're like, so they're the doomers. And
I just get a lot of shade from the two of them. They're very old fashioned. They have like their phones set to the black and white mode. They're real.
Can I talk to my kids? Like, we do a play date while you're here this week.
Exactly. I mean, to be clear, like they never,
liquid glass.
They always had full access to the uncensored internet and whatever device, like we never imposed any limits.
Oh, so it's like the parents that give their kids wine at dinner time. Yeah, exactly.
And they become teetotalers.
Right, exactly.
So that's what's happened.
My son's been using AI models since they started. I mean, I just sort of sat him down and sort of showed him on all of this as well. I think for him, he's now just finished junior year in high school. It's almost kind of no big deal. Okay, that's just how it works. Like, you can have these long conversations and it'll figure things out, and you can use it for this sorts of way as well. He's been doing a fair bit of work on thinking about AI in education, because of sort of the fact that all of his teachers have no idea what any of this is about.
Right.
It's kind of no big deal. And therefore he's surprised that people are so alarmed by it, but also to a certain extent, the people are so enthusiastic by it as well.
It's to me, you look at things, self-driving cars and all those things are, they're going to have a huge impact, but the concept of not using it, again, I feel like it's a form of malpractice. Like if I told my students not to,
think of what you could do with all the parking space if you
don't
have to. Seriously, the potential impact of transportation,
just climate, everything else, right? But in particular in education, like my students when I flip the classroom around and I have them solve problems and I walk around and we look at data from the, cosmology experiments or particle physics experiments, I just dump data on them and they're like, well, what do I do? Even like visual things. Like I had a wave tank and we were generating some waves and I was asking, well, compute the wavelength just based on anything that you have on you right now. And that includes ChatGPT. Take a picture of it, the interferogram, and tell me about the frequency at which these things are working and knowing the water temperature and they were like, what? We can use it's like cheating. I'm like, it's not even a quiz. It's just I want you to understand how interference patterns work, and we can then talk about double slit.
You encourage them to use
I made them use it.
Oh yeah,
and actually, sometimes they get it wrong.
I make an assignment. You have to learn how to use it and figure out how to use it.
I think if we don't do that as professors, we're going to be like a malpractice doctor that doesn't use AI to diagnose a smudge on it, because they're so much better at doing certain things. So tell me, what's your perspective? I mean, we're members of the academy, and we have our tweed jackets and our whatever it is, our suede patch, a suede jacket with the tweed patch. I was very mixed up, Benjamin. Yeah,
I forgot my pipe.
Exactly. I just want to know we're in the faculty club lunch buffets. But Blaise, what are the opportunities? What is Google looking? I mean, Google has my mail, has my calendar, has my photos. It has so much information. I don't feel like it's being used, and I know this is not your domain specifically, but what's the potential for just life enhancement and flourishing of a modern technological society, given that I've been on Gmail and you've probably been on it. You have a Google account, but tell me, it has 20 years of your conversations and probably when your kids were born and all these wonderful. What are you excited about? What can it do for other people's kids that care more about it than maybe yours?
Exactly. Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I mentioned earlier that the people who statistically have the most anxiety about this stuff are the ones who use it the least. I know there are exceptions.
Yeah, which is why it's important for students to use it.
Which is, yes. And the other thing that we see, and this is all from a study that Ipsos did together with Google a couple of months ago that I thought was very revealing. The other big trend is that less economically developed countries way more optimistic about AI than Europe and the US.
It's kind of like they skipped the landline phase. Now
exactly.
They're just straight to AI.
Yeah, they see it as a leapfrogging.
Yeah, they're very optimistic.
Huge leverage.
Force
multiplier.
It's a massive intellectual transfer.
That's right. So, so looking at it from the perspective of education, for instance, we can have all kinds of hand-wringing conversations about AI and education, at UCSD or at University of Chicago or Princeton or whatever. If you're in Burkina Faso, like this is a life changer. Right. And I think a lot of people in the developing world, realize that and are already, starting to make heavy use of these things. Are they perfect? Of course not. They have all kinds of issues. But when it makes such an enormous difference relative to not having, trained teachers, anything like tutors, the resources to get all these things, it's unambiguous. So I don't want to discount the importance of having conversations like, how should it be used in the classroom? Like, what happens when a bunch of kids come in with an assignment that have all just copied and pasted? That's obviously there's something broken happening there. Where it's broken and how it's broken, I think we're figuring out. But let's also, not be confused about what a rich person's problem that is, in effect.
Exactly, right. And doom societies not to because of our own mores.
But also understand, the reason you get those kinds of outcomes is because you haven't actually done the work to figure out how to use it properly.
Exactly.
I'm actually on a faculty committee here at UCSD trying to figure out some of these things. And you'd be surprised at some of the opinions that are in the area. But I mean, we got better assignments.
Yeah.
So you have to presume that this is high school students have calculators.
Just tell them their prompts suck. Yeah, exactly right.
Yes,
but you could do it with anything. You can do it with calculus, right? I mean,
but prompt crafting is a sort of
it is a skill. I just talked to my daughter. My wife's very much in the sounds like your kids. She's very much against it, except when I'll say like, well, here's a picture of the inside of our fridge, and I'm getting hungry in about 2 hours. What can I make for you, darling? And then all of a sudden,
but suddenly it's okay.
So great. But when we're looking at kind of the potential for what we can do and what we can use it for, and really tailoring it. My daughter, she was. I made a jingle for the. Actually, we're going to do this now. Actually, I forgot to do this, but we're going to do it. We have a segment on the show called Judging Books by Their Covers, where we take the book's cover and its title and its subtitle, and we ask the author to judge it for us, because without any other prior information, what can we do? Now, this one's not probably the one that we want to go into because it's not so information dense, but we'll do with this one. The reason I bring it up is because right as I say now, we're going to judge books by their covers. I made a jingle. using Sora or Sona. I get those two confused.
Sora's the video model.
And
OpenAI.
Yeah, Sona, I think, right, is the audio. Makes sense. Sonar, right? So we'll do it for this book. But before I did it, and my daughter was listening, and she's 9 years old, and she is kind of cute. Oh, I want to do that. And so I said, okay, well, what do you want to write about? And like, what kind of style do you want to use? And she's like, oh, I want to do it like Dua Lipa, kind of that style. And I want to do this. And then we put it in there and said, forbidden term. You can't use an actual artist, style. You have to, describe it in words. You can't use any name, Taylor Swift. You can't use their style. You can't ask the model to do that. It's violent and copyright. So my daughter learned prompting, right? She learned, I can't do that, so I have to get around it. So let me describe it as, highly, buoyant, whatever she did, bubbly and happy. And she did it, and she got her own jingle for something else. But now let's judge this book by its cover.
Hey, book lovers, we're judging books by their covers. We know we're not supposed to do it, but into the impossible, there's nothing to it. Let's take a look and judge some books.
Okay, the title is Who Are We Now? The cover looks kind of retro. It's got a sort of collage of images. One of them is of the Jetsons. One of them is of a skull being measured with a craniometer. One of them is of two scissors, one left-handed and one right-handed. There is a pyramid called System of Patriarchy that's got God on top and Earth on the bottom, with a kind of hierarchy with an eye at the top of the pyramid. God, men, women, children, animals, plants, Earth. And there is a by-identification card. There's also a picture of a human ear, modeled and drawn by Mr. Woolner, with the projecting point highlighted as letter A. So that's what's on the cover.
Okay.
I have no idea what an AI that doesn't know about the book will make of that.
What's the title meant to evoke? It's sort of this confluence of man and machine as your perspective evolved from 2016 to 2022. Mm-hmm. Very good. Okay, so we're going to go into a couple of short topics in just a minute. But before that, I cannot fail to ask you about computronium. What is that? What is computronium?
Okay, well, the word was, I believe, coined by Norman Margolis, physicist and computer scientist, working on this in the 80s and 90s. His definition of it was a cellular automaton or some kind of highly local form of computation that would be as efficient as matter can be at computation. I have a somewhat broader definition of computronium, which is that it is a state of matter that computes. So, just as we talk about gases, liquids, solids, I think there is another state of matter that is maybe the most important one to us that we don't have a name for, which is what we're made out of, and also what machines are made out of. And I would call that computronium because I think that its key functional property is that it computes. And its key statistical property is that unlike all of those other states of matter, it doesn't have either the kind of totally random statistics of a gas, nor does it have the sort of locally ordered, but essentially uniform statistics of something like a liquid or a solid. It has self-dissimilar multifractal sort of statistics, meaning, it's different at every scale and it's made out of parts that are distinct. And that's true kind of recursively.
Sam Altman has proposed that in the future, you'll be given an amount of universal basic compute. How does this play into that? So we're born with a certain amount, some we can cultivate, presumably.
So it's also an old idea.
Yeah, I'm sure.
It's not Sam's idea.
Right, yeah. I'm sure there's some science fiction movies about this too, right? Isaac Asimov or Clark. Where do you come down on that? What is your orientation towards, as a natural right, computation as sort of an inheritance that we're all owed, but we can also cultivate and grow on our own through our own merit, perhaps?
I don't know. I don't know what the future economy should look like. I'm pretty sure that it's got to look different from the way it looks now. I believe I'm with Sam and with many other people who think about this stuff in believing that given that our society, our global human civilization, right, is at this point well above the wealth threshold where everybody could have secure housing, food, medical care, education, it is a crime that's not something that we can all rely on. That just seems like a moral failing. How does that work? And how does the tension stay in the system that makes interesting stuff happen is an unsolved problem in my opinion. So I don't know whether free computing is the answer to that, and I'm not sure about rights. I think it's more complicated than I don't think there's a God's eye view that says everybody has such and such rights. I think this is more of a social contract for mutual flourishing.
And Ben, do you foresee a future of the haves and have-nots that would be of concern from a moral philosophy perspective?
I should say, the universal basic UBC is variation on the way it's phrased. It's a variation on universal basic income, as a sort of older sort of idea, which is, and probably is an improvement on this in the sense to which one of the things that digital economies do is they reduce the marginal cost for the production of durable goods, which means that the having cash to purchase durable goods is actually not the thing that the most logical thing. What you need is something more universal basic services or universal basic access or universal basic agency. And compute in some ways arguably is a reasonable index for many of those kinds of things. Maybe it can be under certain circumstances. Yes. I mean, in terms of the AI and the haves and have-nots, like again, I think this can go in a lot of different directions, right? And also I think to a certain extent, some of the ways in which some of my colleagues sort of insist on defining the present and future state in starkly, let's say, critical terms, actually has, in a certain degree, a kind of self-fulfilling capacity where it becomes difficult to convince them that, in fact, there are other possibilities that maybe need to be emphasized. Let me put it sort of this way. Like, if I were to tell you that there was a hypothetical machine, and this hypothetical machine took and consolidated all of the professional knowledge, expertise, and agency that has been made artificially scarce and consolidated not just in the global north, but in 12 cities and 22 universities in the global north, and jealously protected in this place, but that this machine would essentially provide a kind of massive agency and knowledge transfer that would be available to everybody in the world through devices and interfaces they already understand in every language for a monthly subscription fee equivalent to Netflix or free. It would be hard to argue that this wouldn't this in principle wouldn't have at least the strong potential for a kind of revolutionary disruption in dismantling that artificial scarcity, which is, maybe bad for the Ivy League, but boo-hoo. But there's not this sort of guarantee that any of this sort of work, that this will sort of work in this kind of, that would work in this kind of direction here as well. But I think this, in a certain sense, is like the vision that we would want to cultivate. And why is that? Not even necessarily from a kind of first principles, moral philosophy, Rawlsian ethics or something, but just for principles of collective intelligence, that if you have, 8 billion, human minds as opposed to AI, AI human level minds. And that we are, as a species, just not benefiting from the full participation and creativity and agency and ingenuity of all of these sort of people that to sort of unlock this. That's the intelligence explosion that we should be pushing for. Yeah. And so there's not a prediction. No. It's not a sort of thing, but in terms of what is essentially a kind of goal states, we should be sort of steering this towards. I think this would. Now, does that constitute or presuppose some degree of universal compute access for everyone? It probably would. Whether or not that's, this doesn't mean this is instituted by some sort of New World Order global superstate.
Digital currency backed.
Or Sam Altman or on a blockchain or any of these kinds of things. But I think the presumption is if the goal is to use these technologies for the unlocking of the collective intelligence that has been henceforth suppressed by historical legacy, it would require something like that. Yes.
Blaise, can't thank you enough for being down here. Everyone should pick up the copy of this book. Where should people be in touch with you? Anything else you'd like people to know about this wonderful new book and your corpus of knowledge and future projects? What's next on the horizon after this? Well-deserved vacation, I hope.
Yes. I thank you so much for asking. I'm definitely not working on another book now. I've written one a year for the past several years, and I think I'm good for a little bit. But yeah, I'm easy to find, on probably LinkedIn is the easiest.
Okay. Benjamin, it's always nice to have such brilliant colleagues as you, and I hope we can do this more often.
Anytime you like.
With more, but just keep sending me wonderful guests like Blaise. I really can't thank you enough.
My pleasure.
All right.
This has really been a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for coming down.
The question of whether AI can truly experience the world the way that we do is just the beginning. If you're fascinated by how intelligence emerges from the fundamental building blocks of reality, check out my episode with Sarah Walker, where we dive deep into assembly theory and what that really means for matter to become alive and aware. The connection between physics, biology, and consciousness run deeper than even I ever would have expected. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Hey everybody, I'm usually the one that asks my guests to judge their books by their covers, but today I'm asking myself to judge my own book by its cover. My newest book, Focus Like a Nobel Prize Winner, is chock full of advice, life tips, and focus and productivity tips from from 9 of the world's greatest minds, Nobel laureates ranging from economics to peace to physics, of course. It launches September 9th, which is also my birthday. So go to Amazon and get the Kindle copy today.